HVAC 360 is brought to you today by the Construction Channel. That's right, it's time once again for those mid-season improvements to our lineup. First, meet the Plungers. They're a family of plumbers who always stick together. Then, on Can We Build It Thursdays, we have the Sheet Metal Shop, where we mix hardcore music and fabrication how-tos that will delight the whole family. And for the active crowd, we have brought back the classic obstacle course, HVAC Ninja Warrior, where crawl spaces, attics, and acts of contortion are just the status quo. Set your TiVos today so you don't miss a minute. Welcome back, Matt Nelson here, your host for HVAC 360, helping you be the best and the brightest in the field of HVAC. Each week I'm either sharing information, lessons learned, or talking with industry experts, but I don't stop there as usual. I want to encourage you to go down and double down on your weekly helping of HVAC knowledge by jumping on over to HVAC360.com and join my growing community of people just like you. All right, so what do we have this week? This week, I was going to do another seminar summary, and, I watched the whole seminar. I made some notes to kind of relay to you, and then I look down and I go, you know what, it's not much of a seminar summary. The people that put on the seminar, they really deserved more than my notes really contained. I mean, it was really kind of detailed, but I wanted to give you something of kind of what I took away, and kind of, this is something when we're talking about this topic, and the session was HVAC for tall and super tall buildings in hot and humid climates. So basically, when they talked about and they went through different scenarios. Normally, I kind of avoid as a general theme, tall and super tall buildings, because it doesn't really apply to most everybody. Not everybody gets to work on buildings like this, nor should they. I mean, this is not something that you're like, hey, you know what? I want to volunteer to work on a tall, super tall, building. If you don't have the expertise. And the more that I watch the seminar, I go, there's a lot that goes into these tall buildings, and that really just, so that's why I want to back it off. So this is going to be some of my thoughts and my takeaways, just generally speaking, on some of the insights that I got from the seminar, but it's not necessarily a summary, because that doesn't do it justice. So, I mean, the first thing they started talking about, and of course, when you start off in a design, the first thing you're going to go for is you're going to go for the load calculation. But that load calculation is really dependent on accurate climate data. And usually, most of the programs that we use out there as engineers are, they're preloaded with this bin data. Now, it's important that they made a differentiation between weather data and climate data. They said weather data is kind of the snapshot. That's what's happening today. Those are the temperatures and things like that. Climate data is more of an aggregated historical weather trend that lasts decades. So you really want something that is, pretty rock solid. I mean, these are going to be expensive to work on, to build. So they really want good climate data. Now, there is a lot of sources for this climate data, and the more that he talked about, different, you get, different sources from airports, from just, airplanes, just everywhere. The national, NOAA. There's a lot of different places that you can get this climate data, and it really is an art form. But I guess the importance to know, at least for probably the vast majority of us that don't work on tall buildings, is that, just going into the load calculation and picking a location doesn't always work, and you have to be aware of that. For example, they gave a great example of a city in Taiwan where they were building an airport. Now, the airport was located on the other side of a mountain, and the weather data was completely different. So if you selected that city and applied it to that airport, it would have nothing to do with reality. A lot of the same things are true for coastal regions. If you live near an ocean, probably even a large body of water, but near an ocean, and that includes, any sort of inlets or whatever, as little as, 60 miles or so can make a dramatic difference. I mean, that's, it's an hour's drive, but when you're using these load calculations, it's not like you have, every specific point in the United States, or wherever you're living. It's not like you have that kind of resource where you could pick the exact spot where your building is going. But when you're building these super tall buildings, that's the kind of data that you need. So this is really kind of one of those specialists that you need to kind of add to the team to be able to make sure that you don't screw this up. Now, not only climate data as far as the ground floor, but it's really interesting how the climate differed from the ground floor to, say, 600 meters, which was kind of the general, that was the tall building they were talking about. It was a tall building, 600 meters, and it was dramatically different. So these tall buildings, you have things like ground effects, reflectivity. You have microclimates that exist, down at that level, but you don't have that at the penthouse. It's more a little bit more consistent, but it doesn't necessarily. It doesn't have the same values. And there's a couple different ways you can do this, and I'm not necessarily going to get into this on this episode, but they're typically, they talked again and again about this lapse rate, and the lapse rate was simply it was a temperature lapse rate, and basically what it did was, this is kind of an elevation gradient, so they can kind of say, okay, if you're going to be at one temperature at ground level, and you go up a certain number of feet, you're going to be at a different temperature, and it's kind of a linear relationship. Well, you got to be careful about that, because there's a lot of different things that play into this, whether you have the humidity, the location of where you're at. Some of these actually had temperature inversions, so you ended up at the ground level, because usually you'd have this cooling effect as you go up into the atmosphere. It was not necessarily the case when you had situations where you had a temperature inversion. Now, a temperature inversion is where you have you have a warm pocket of air that's trapped below a colder pocket of air, switch that around. You have a cold pocket of air that's trapped by a warm pocket of air above it. So as you went up, in some cases, it actually got warmer. So generally speaking, when you take a look at these super tall buildings, it was important to, when you did load calculations, usually you do load calculations and you're like, okay, I just picked the weather data for this particular building and I'm good. That doesn't happen with a super tall building. You basically have to slice and dice it a little bit, all the way up to 600 meters. 600 meters, they were saying it was about 140 stories. So what you basically have is that, every maybe 10 stories, you'd have to have a different load calculation based on a different climate profile. So it's not only temperature, but wind effects, as you go higher up in the building, you do have stronger winds. Now, it's interesting that they were analyzing some of these buildings that were coastal regions, and a lot of them were, you'd have a lot of, traditional winds out of the northwest in the northern atmosphere, or the northern hemisphere. But they'd also have these counter winds that would kind of be coming back to the ocean, as the day cooled off, or going from night to day. They'd have these other winds. That didn't exist up in the upper atmosphere. It was pretty much consistent, that northwest wind hitting that building in a single direction. So That was interesting. They actually toyed with the idea of a natural ventilation. Could you naturally ventilate a building like this? And one of the reasons I watched this, because it did have Peter Simmons, and he did do this particular section, and he basically said no. And then he went on to explain why that wasn't a good idea. And it's very complicated. Because of, you have stack pressures, you have wind pressures, and they can be, 10 times stronger than you would see on the ground up in the upper elevations of the buildings. So it really was an interesting dissection. One of the things I found was just mildly interesting. He's talking about the 600 meters of building. He said that typically when you're dealing with a building like this, you have like the first 200 meters are offices, and then you have 200 meters of apartments. Now he's generalizing, of course, but I've just found this interesting. And then the third 200 meters would be like a hotel or some sort of high-end hotel. Which was, I never really thought about it. I know when you look at the super tall buildings, that there is, an interesting mix, because when you talk about, the transportation systems that are in these buildings, they really get quite unique. Just being able to transport people back and forth, up and down, through these buildings, but. That was really interesting how you kind of segmented the building like that. Now there are some interesting kind of things. I talked about how it got cooler as you went up in the building. The atmosphere obviously got cooler. That really does kind of save you on some of the cooling costs, but. That does actually, it was an interesting effect because it does kind of keep cooling off, and when you don't have quite the same temperature, you could end up with freezing conditions even in locations like in the Middle East, in Dubai or whatever, and or say even Houston, where they were holding the conference. So it was one of those things where you had to, even at the ground floors where you'd never even consider freezing conditions because they just don't happen. Way up at the top, you really do have to account for in your design for these freezing conditions. They do change like that. So that was kind of one of the pluses, is that you get some, basically free cooling, or it would cost less to cool and heat that, or at least cool the upper spaces. But you do end up paying more because of the fan energy and the pump energy, because of the height. The fan energy because the air is less dense. So those are some of the things, the trade-offs that you did, going from a ground level to up high. Now, one of the other things that they mentioned that kind of really blew my mind is that if you had a building that was 600 meters, conceivably you could be in a different climate zone when you get to the upper floors. When you get to the top of the building, the top half of the building, or whatever, you would end up actually switching climate zones. So you could be at, they were saying, climate zone 0 at the ground floor, and then by the time that you reached, the 100th floor, you'd end up being in climate zone 1. Obviously, remember that the climate zones are determined by the heating and cooling, degree days. So the number of hours that you're heating and cooling. So that's how you can actually change the climate zone by changing the elevation, even though you're in the same location, which is kind of again kind of interesting to me. So and then you kind of get into I guess they dove into the idea of where can we go from here? I mean, as far as height. And they said that pretty much 600 meters is really the kind of the limit of your average super tall building. Obviously, you could build higher. Technically, you could do it, but at 600 meters, really, it's really the minimum required for normal function. And it's really the realistic occupied limit. I mean, you could get 650, you could get 700 meters. That was in the realm of possibility. But if you got any higher, you would end up in the zone. I mean, especially, you'd end up in the zone where you'd really have to acclimatize your body to that. So once you got up there, you couldn't really, go right to the ground floor. It would just be too much. That's pretty much the problem. And unless you intended to live at that height for long periods of time, it's not really something that's doable. So that was one of the things that was very interesting to me. So one of the things they talked about, and so this is one of the questions: when do you really have to get into the nitty gritty here? They said about 300 meters and above. This is when you really need to get the climatic data, not only get the right climatic data for your particular location, but also take a look at it, vertically with your building. So you'll need to look at the elevation as well as your location. 300 meters and below, that's going to be there's going to be a lot of effects from microclimates. You're going to have probably adjacent buildings, and that's one of the things too. They said that when you take a look at some of the climate data, it might be valuable for a certain period of time. Say for instance what do you have? An airport. So you get the climate data from the airport. Now the airport may have nothing around it, and it's collecting climate data. And then all of a sudden they build up, a city around it. All of a sudden that climate data for that particular airport isn't valid anymore. That old climate data, it just changes things with the wind, with the microclimates, with a whole bunch of stuff that you're going to really have to take a look at something different, and you're going to have to look at that a little bit harder. So if something's really critical, you might want to consider doing this. They said that 100 meters and higher, you really get a lot of stack effect issues. So that's when you have tendency of blowing out windows and things like that, just because of the stack effect and some of the pressures in the building. Now they did say. One of the things they're like, well, can computers solve everything? In this particular case, especially when they talked about the stack effect and blowing out windows, and they said that wind loads, at least in their opinion, wind loads are still best determined in a wind tunnel. So you get a scale model. You measure the different heights and things like that, and you can't really use computational fluid dynamics. It just didn't work. I think it's either just too complicated, they didn't have enough horsepower, but in their opinion, the wind tunnel was still kind of a valid, or not a valid, but and critical component to building a tall tower. So that was some of the interesting things. Especially when you get into computational fluid dynamics, you take a look at using a wind tunnel. You look at hiring somebody just for the climate. That's when you're in a really serious, really technical sort of building. And you got a lot of brain horsepower around the table when you talk about the design and how you're going to approach building a building. All right, that really isn't most of us, but it's fun to take the occasional stroll down, what other people do, as far as talking about what HVAC generally looks like. I mean, we didn't talk about systems, we didn't talk a lot about anything else, but the kind of the setup that you need for starting to design that system. It really is interesting how these different things play together. And, so I just wanted to leave that kind of my summary, my little takeaway from that. Again, what they went through was really, there was a lot of technical stuff. There was some good stuff in there. But I just kind of wanted to give, my 2 cents and my impression, and just talk a little bit about really tall buildings. Whether they're tall, whether they're super tall, whether they're mega structures, it's one of those, fun things that, we kind of, always they're iconic wherever they are in the wherever they are built in the world. And it's something that I think we wonder about, whether we, replace, residential units, or, we work on just, single story structures. I think that it fascinates us. So there again, I hope this was interesting to you. Maybe a little bit helpful. If you know somebody who's looking for more information about this topic or might enjoy this, consider passing this episode along. I'd really appreciate it. That's probably one of the best ways that we get more listeners. If you're not a subscriber, jump on over to HVAC360.com, sign up for that newsletter. That goes out every week, and I have a lot of fun with that. And lastly, I would be greatly honored if you'd go and leave me a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, and also subscribe to the YouTube version of this podcast. That really helps, get recognition for the podcast. And also on the YouTube side, it allows me to eventually, when I get enough subscribers, to be able to do some other fun things for you guys. All right, well, that's a wrap for this episode of HVAC 360. I'm Matt Nelson, helping you be the best and the brightest in the field of HVAC. And as always, know what you build and share what you know.